What has been the impact of the SEC Cybersecurity Rule in year one, and what should be on every organization's radar in year two? That's the topic for discussion in this episode of the SaaS Security Show. Welcome, everyone. I'm Sarah Fraser, your host, and I'm joined by two esteemed guests today. Bob Zukis, the founder and CEO of the Digital Directors Network, and Idan Fast, CTO and co-founder of Grip Security. Gentlemen, welcome, and thank you for joining me today.
Great to be here, sir.
All right. Now, let's give our listeners more context into who you are, what you do, and the perspectives that you'll be bringing to our conversation today. So, as I mentioned, Bob Zukis is the founder and CEO of Digital Directors Network, the only network focused exclusively on systemic risk and digital and cybersecurity risk oversight in the corporate boardroom. Bob is regarded as the world's leading advocate, educator, and advisor on issues pertaining to the C-suite executives and the corporate boardroom. He's taught CIOs and CISOs from some of the country's most prominent brands, including United Airlines, Kraft, Amazon, Pfizer, Sempra Energy, and many more. Bob is also a retired PwC advisory partner, where he led PwC's IT strategy and operations practice. Idan Fast is the co-founder and CTO of Grip Security, the pioneer of SaaS identity risk management. Prior to founding Grip with partner Leo Yari, Idan was the group CTO of Kahoot, where he oversaw the innovation initiatives while also leading a large team of developers that perform cutting-edge research in embedded software. He also served as an embedded security research lead for the Israeli Intelligence Service. You both have very, very impressive backgrounds. I'm looking forward to the insights that you'll be sharing with us today. But let's bring it a little closer to home now. So, Bob, in your own words, please tell us more about the Digital Directors Network and the work that you're doing there.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Great to be here. Idan, great to share the stage with you. I'm also a former professor at the USC Marshall School of Business right there over my shoulder, but our football team stinks this year, so we don't talk about that very much. DDN was formed 7 years ago to build the practice and profession of digital and cybersecurity oversight to strengthen the board as a control in the digital business system, both for value creation and value protection. And I was working pretty extensively throughout the governance community and had the insight that the legacy governance community and associations can't solve a problem they don't understand because they don't understand the technologies. And so we needed to bring the IT and cyber leadership forward and the IT and cyber industry forward to the boardroom to step up and frankly solve the problems that our innovations have created. And that's exactly what we're doing at DDN.
Great, great. And I've been watching your company from afar. It looks like you're really growing and adding and addressing some important initiatives. So thank you again for joining us. And I do have to say, I am a fan of the Trojan Marching Band, so have been for many years. Yeah. All right, Idan, let's shift over to you. Tell us more about your role at Grip and the common challenges that you see enterprises dealing with.
Sure. So I'm co-founder, CTO of Grip. The company is almost 4 years old now. So, kind of taking from crawling to walking, sort of in the journey. I think within the role, what I mostly see and within Grip, I oversee our customer success function as well. So I have a lot of interaction with sort of the implementation and operationalization journeys that our customers have. And the challenge that they come across with, I think it's sort of a three-component aspect to it. One is that the problem space is changing very rapidly. There's a lot of new frontiers in cybersecurity. You can see, I think, cloud, SaaS, and identity are probably maybe the buzzy ones right now. Maybe AI, both governance and data protection is happening as we speak. And these are all like pretty new challenges in their current form. Combine that with, I would say, lack of talent or the difficult aspects of both hiring and training people into roles that change very rapidly. And And on the talent production side, doesn't happen in the order of magnitude that it needs to occur in. And then three is just the tremendous amount of different tools that are needed to solve the issue, both from a tech perspective and a process perspective. I think it's a pretty complex problem space.
Yeah. Companies are really SaaS reliant these days, so a lot of good work happening there, and appreciate you raising all the concerns and issues, and I know we're going to get more into it. But Bob, I remember about a year ago, you and I were on a webcast before the SEC rule went into effect. We were talking about specifics of the rule. It was also brand new, and what was required to be in compliance with it. But now we're 1 year in. I think yesterday was the 1 year anniversary of it going into effect. And so I'm curious, over the last 12 months, what have been the most significant operational changes companies have had to make in response to the rule? And do you think that these changes have improved cybersecurity practices?
Yeah, I do actually. I think they have improved cybersecurity practices and certainly awareness of this issue at the leadership level. My assessment a year in is, and there's two parts to the rule. There's incident disclosure, and then there's disclosure around risk management strategy, and then management and governance of cybersecurity. My headline is for the compliance status is non-compliance on the incident disclosure part. I think there's an enormous amount of, let's call it what it is. I think it's deliberate non-compliance with the incident disclosure rules. There's been 50 odd 8Ks filed, either Section 105 or Section 801, and issuers are not describing the impacts of incidents. What the SEC wanted companies to do is not just ring the alarm bell that we have a situation, but explain to their investors why they're ringing the alarm bell. And that's not what they're doing. They're not explaining the impacts of the incident. And a year in at this stage, it can't be anything short of a deliberate act on I think a lot of filers to not to want to tell that story, because I think the story's more gnarly than they want it to be. And so we're seeing non-compliance on the incident disclosure side, and a little more superficial compliance on the risk management and strategy side, and what companies are doing to manage and govern these issues.
That's interesting. Is there any ramifications for the non-compliance? Is the SEC coming back and asking for more information, or what's happening there?
They've done that twice, and they finalized two of those interactions. And when those interactions get finalized, they get released publicly. The SEC, and we talked to Director Girding on this. The SEC is working with issuers through this process during this first year to help them comply, to get these disclosures where they need to be. So most of those interactions are still open. So I think there's a substantial amount of back and forth going on between the SEC and the issuers to help them coach them up on these issues. But to me, this is an indication of why the SEC put this rule in place and why we needed it. Because I think companies' processes for making that materiality determination are very underdeveloped. So I think it's an indication of why we needed this rule to begin with. This is common sense stuff that in a process area that is largely underdeveloped for most companies, and they're developing it for the first time, I think.
Yeah.
Do you think, currently, I think most of the pressure in that regard is coming from sort of more of the regulatory bodies out there. Do you see any winds of change in the investor community to add pressure on their end as investors to want to see more scrutiny and transparency in that regard?
Yeah, that's starting. It's starting on the private equity side for their portfolio companies, and it's starting for institutional investors too. Institutional investors have been paying attention to this issue for a while because they're the ultimate bearer of the costs of these incidents, whether it's stock price degradation, or if you're United Health, $3 billion of cash that's now vanished from your balance sheet to deal with the ramifications of the incident that you had. So they should be a lot more engaged because it's their money. when companies fail on these issues. And I think they're starting to pay attention and to wake up to it, both for private equity and for institutional investors. The institutional investors were for the important provision of having director cyber expertise disclosure that the SEC dropped from the final rules. CalPERS, the Council for Institutional Investors, others wanted that to happen because that's a common sense control. It only serves the hackers when that control is weak. And so they articulated that in letters to the SEC supporting that part of the proposed rule, and the SEC dropped that from the final rule. But there was a big group of organizations, and we can talk about them, that didn't want that rule in place. It's a very interesting camp in the for side versus the against side of that simple disclosure. Tell us if you have somebody in the room that's a cybersecurity expert. There are groups that don't want that to happen, including the hackers.
You know, Bob, you mentioned earlier in your comments about materiality. I'm wondering, has that, I think that's been further defined, but perhaps you could comment on that. Plus, I also know there was a lot of uncertainty from CISOs on the impact of their role. Would they be held accountable? What are the liability concerns? What's going on with all of that?
Yeah, there was a lot of I think fear around the accountability issue because of what we saw the SEC do, but that was really for a different reason. I don't think I think the CISO is as accountable as any executive is to their job and their responsibilities. If you sign off on something that is incorrect, you're going to have as much liability as any executive would. We're seeing CISOs demand, and rightfully so, coverage under directors and officers, insurance policies now, and that's should be a prerequisite for any CISO that's taking a new job to be covered under that policy, because it pays your legal bills and gives you some comfort, like all other executives have if there's litigation. And this is now a litigious job for most CISOs. The materiality part of your question, a lot of confusion around that, because it's the first time the SEC's fairly objective materiality standard has had to be applied to the technical issues and the nuance of a cybersecurity incident. So there was a lot of confusion and I think bad information floating around people trying to put quantitative thresholds in place. And that's not what the SEC wants. It's not the foundation for the SEC's materiality standards. It's really in the eyes of a reasonable investor, either qualitatively or quantitatively, is this information useful in them making their investment decision? And if you think it is material to that investment decision, then you disclose. You don't think it's material, you don't disclose, and you keep monitoring it. You keep your incident response plan process going, and you gather more information. And if you ever reach that threshold, then you do tell your investors about it. That's really what the SEC is all about. They're a disclosure regime. They want more transparency. They want more accountability, and they want companies to mature their understanding of the digital business system and how incidents impact a wide range of stakeholders and what that means for investors.
Yeah. Idan, anything you want to add there?
I think on our end, I do see not a direct impact. I think people originally claimed things like, most CISOs will now roll up to GC due to, changes in the role, et cetera. It's, I think the doomsday predictions haven't happened. But I think while it was introduced, it did raise awareness in boardrooms to the needs of following through and giving board level scrutiny over their risk programs. As even inside New Grip, we're seeing a tremendous increase in the amount of reporting that customers are asking for us to be able to provide back to their boardrooms.
Interesting.
And I think that is a good shift. And I'm sure this is where Bob will agree that it also needs to come with better training for board members on what it actually means. Just like it's new for the SEC and the market. Most board members are inadequately trained to be able to ask the right and hard questions on risk programs, and that's definitely another aspect that we will need to mature as an industry in.
Mhm. Good. Yeah, you're talking about boardroom awareness. Obviously, the rules about transparency and disclosure. But question for both of you, do you think the rule has helped organizations become more cyber resilient?
I'd say aware, resilient, quite yet, no.
Okay,
But awareness is the first step towards actually understanding the risk environment you're
sure.
operating in. Some companies, yeah, the early adopters, but this has not crossed the chasm yet.
Hmm.
This hasn't jumped the chasm yet. So it's still the thoughtful directors, the thoughtful leaders that are paying attention to this in the right way. But that's the early adopters. That's the exception rather than the rule at this stage. But ultimately, what I like to say is, the ultimate regulator on this issue is the hacker.
Mm.
So you'll be regulated whether the government step up or not. That's not the important, coercive force here. It's the hackers. And there's plenty of information that can help you strengthen your role as a control and improve your risk profile. The evidence shows that. The evidence shows that leadership and boardroom leadership on these issues matters, and maturing these processes matters to create value and to have a better risk posture as well. It's not even debatable at this stage. So patient heal thyself. There's plenty of organizations like ours that can help you figure this out, but you got to show the initiative to step it forward. It's not going to be done for you unless it's done by the hackers to
Hmm.
you, and then you'll react.
Hmm. Good, good. So I have to ask, are there any gotchas that enterprises are struggling with or should be aware of?
Idan, you want to take that? You got anything top of mind on that one?
Um, I think a couple of things that we did see is an increase in how important it is deemed for different organizations to beef up their incident response plans, especially in aspects that tie to things like chain of custody, roles and responsibility, war rooms, and how they're run, with the understanding that there is now a bigger forensic and legal aspect to how incidents are run, and somebody might require them to look into it if and when it does happen. I would say, other than that, I think it made a bigger splash. It also coincided, I think, with everything that happened with Uber, and it kind of bubbled up a lot of questions in the industry that didn't realize to a big shift. Whereas in practice, it just provides, I think Bob said it well, common sense transparency back
Mhm.
to investors from the industry.
Good.
Yeah, and I would say the biggest gotcha is the gotcha of systemic risk. And so SolarWinds was a wake-up call on
Mm.
malicious attacks that try to leverage the system and turn it against itself. CrowdStrike was a wake-up call that, the system can collapse on itself erroneously or unintentionally. And most boards, most leadership teams, most CISOs and CIOs aren't paying attention to risk in this context yet. You guys had an interesting data point in your survey. 85% of SaaS apps, 91% of AI tools are unmanaged and
Mhm.
ungoverned. And so that's an indication of the expanding complexity of the complex system and the expanding difficulty of understanding the risk environment at any one point within the system that can create damage throughout the system. So that dimension of risk is an artifact of how complex these systems have become. And we're not governing it, we're not managing it really at all,
Mhm.
because we're fairly blind to that concept. It's what we teach at DDN. It's kind of foundational to what we do. And others are starting to talk about it. The government's talking about it because of critical infrastructure. Again, some of the leading practices and early adopters are paying attention to it in that kind of context in the right way. But the vast majority are just blowing right past it. And I think that's the biggest gotcha, because that's a big impact if you get have a problem there systemically.
Yeah, good point. Thank you for raising that. Bob is referring to Grip's 2025 SaaS Security Risk Report, which does cite a high percentage of shadow SaaS and shadow AI, as much as 85 to 90%. That's flying under the radar and going unmanaged. Certainly there's a lot of ramifications there, not only with credential usage and poor credential behaviors, but also when an employee leaves and the IT or SecOps team does not know about that particular app, and it remains open. And we saw Midnight Blizzard, not quite from an employee leaving, but a developer leaving a test account open, and that was hacked, and that's how attackers got in for that particular attack. So certainly a lot of unknowns there. Idan, do you want to comment any further about the potential consequences?
Yeah, definitely. I think software is eating the world, and SaaS is the leading delivery model for software. And so it's unsurprising that we're seeing more and more risk emerge from the usage of software in a SaaS model. And I think traditionally it was sort of a siloed approach, right? Where organizations thought, oh, we'll set up a SaaS security program. And I think over time, people are now realizing that SaaS is, in Bob's word, more systemic across the entire business. And pretty much every different security program has some element to it that is deeply affected by SaaS and the security of the SaaS applications in use. So you mentioned identity, right? Mm-hmm. This is probably one of the biggest controls that we can apply in SaaS, and dangling access from ex-employees is surprisingly one of the first aspects in cybersecurity where there was hard regulatory requirements starting from Sarbanes-Oxley, right? I think the SOX demand for 24-hour cut of access post departure is probably one of the first impacts of like direct regulations on cybersecurity as a business. AI governance is starting to become a bigger and bigger issue. I would not be surprised if we see stronger regulations in place. Open parentheses, probably not in the U.S. For in the new administration, but probably in Europe with the new AI Act and whatever will come of it going forward. Third-party risk, right? Just as much as these are SaaS vendors, these are also just third parties that the organization is operating with, and is becoming more and more dependent on them as a business, and the risk that they carry as third parties is becoming a bigger and bigger chunk out of the risk pie that organizations are carrying. So I'd say overall, it just touches on everything, and you even have these sorts of quirky instances where, for example, I think it was about 2 weeks ago where Disney published that a disgruntled ex-employee retained access to their menu management SaaS system in the Disney parks and edited out the allergen information for peanuts. And I think it shows just how big the impact and dependency that we have on SaaS and software is becoming, and just how systemic the risk that it could pose is.
Yeah, certainly the happiest place became not very happy at all. So
is there one add-on to and we had promised we would give people an opinion on the new administration and what that means for these rules. Right. But so whose responsibility is it to make sure that the management team is paying attention to risk in the right way, systemic risks? That's the board's responsibility to make sure, and the board has a responsibility to implement a reasonable system of oversight and then to monitor that system. So if management's not paying attention to risk in the right way, the board is there to make sure that they are doing their job in that kind of a context. So the board can't do that job unless the board understands these issues at the depth that Idan just articulated. And that requires expertise. This is not amateur hour where you take a financial expert and try to pretend that they understand all risk contexts and all domains, and a generalist on the board can drive value in these domains. It doesn't work that way. There's some people in the legacy governance community that think risk is risk and it's a universal concept, but it's not. There's a reason why no one goes to their plumber for dental work, right? Those are two very different skills, two very different risk environments. They're both wet environments, but they're hardly transferable, right? So that's what we're dealing with here. That's why we need expertise in the boardroom.
Yeah. So what can enterprises do, or how can they continue to improve their security operations and systemic risk governance? And then I'm also going to ask you to touch on what you alluded to. What will be the impact of the new U.S. administration?
Yeah, well, at the board level, it's a system of governance. It's getting the expertise, skills, structure, and scope, and having the right understanding of risk. So if you do that at the board level, the superpower of strengthening leadership as a control on these issues is that it strengthens all the other controls. And we're not going to solve this problem at the level it needs to be solved until we do strengthen the board as a control. And the evidence shows that when we do this, the companies that are living through this as leading lights and leading practitioners are driving more business value and are reducing their risk. So I'll argue all day long with anybody that believes otherwise, but together with this growing army of people that are living proof that this works, and the board as a functioning, high-performing part of the system adds value to the organization, is a reality.
Good. Good. Anything to add, Idan?
No, I think Bob articulated it well. Maybe on the next point on the impact of the U.S. administration, let's say broadly speaking, I think we'll see a stronger chasm being created between EU-based companies and US-based ones, which I think is already, with maybe GDPR was sort of a pivotal point in that regard, and the difference in privacy regulations between the Atlantic is going to be bigger and bigger over time, and honestly, will probably draw a lot of innovation out of Europe into the US. You can see it, even from a startup point of view in our little world. The amount of startup innovation being created outside of Europe versus in shows a tremendous amount of innovation loss happening there, and with a bigger difference in regulation that will be probably introduced in the new administration, this will grow further and further. On the other side, probably as consumers, we will have some sort of negative impact personally on our personal lives due to this, right? This is at its core meant to protect us as individuals and consumers, and we'll probably see less negative downstream effects happening on companies that are not, I would say, up to par with how we would expect them to behave as consumers.
Good, good. Okay, Bob, you're on the hot seat. What's going to be the impact?
Yeah, this issue has never been driven by government regulation. The SEC is 15 years behind the curve on these issues. And what they had just done for SEC cybersecurity disclosure is common sense. It's very lightweight regulation, but there's a group that is working against that. There's been proposals put through Congress to repeal that. And if it goes away, it goes away. But what it did do is it showed that it brought transparency and visibility. And the best regulator, the most effective regulator on this issue is the hacker. The hacker's not going away. So if the government coercion and compliance piece of this goes away, leading companies are the ones defining the standards here. They always have been. And that's where the effectiveness comes in, because the risk environment isn't going to change. The risk environment is going to get worse. So regardless of whether the SEC is forcing you to a compliance standard or not, if you have half a brain, you should be addressing these issues, and the leading practitioners and the leading companies that are already doing this are doing the right things for their customers and for their investors and for themselves, frankly, because I don't know why you'd want this target on your back.
Yeah, good point. And I appreciate that the hackers provide the regulation and drive the bus here. So excellent points to both of you. And thank you again, Bob and Idan, for joining me today. I've enjoyed talking with you both. We are out of time, but to our listeners, I want to say thank you for spending time with us. We will be sharing the link to download the 2025 SaaS Security Risk Report that we mentioned in our conversation, if you'd like to read more on the topic of Shadow SaaS and Shadow AI. Additionally, in the next episode of the SaaS Security Show, we will be diving into the specifics of the report, what the data is telling us, plus offer practical strategies for regaining control over a sprawling SaaS environment. If you'd like to learn more about the Digital Directors Network, head on over to digitaldirectors.network. And for Grip, that URL is grip.security. But until our next show, again, thank you, Bob, Idan. Thank you to our listeners, and may you all have an uneventful day.